Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. Tonight, we take you back to 13th century Hungary, a land gripped by fear and crumbling under the shadow of the Mongol horde. At the heart of this chaos stood Béla IV, a young king burdened by the weight of a collapsing kingdom and a ruthless enemy approaching fast. With no viable path to victory, Béla made a chilling decision: to burn his own cities to the ground, denying the invaders shelter and supplies, even at the cost of his people's lives. What followed was not just fire and ruin, but a legacy of cold justice, forced reconstruction, and fear that echoed through generations. In this episode, we delve into the fall, the brutal aftermath, and the ashes left behind by a king who tried to save his crown by sacrificing his country. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. In the early years of the 13th century, when church bells still marked the hours in sleepy stone villages and peasants toiled in mist-covered fields, the Kingdom of Hungary remained largely untouched by the winds of fate that had already begun to tear across the steppes of Asia. To the far east, beyond forests, rivers, and mountain ranges the Hungarians had never seen, an empire unlike any other had risen. A terrifying force that swallowed kingdoms whole, left no survivors, and moved like an unstoppable tide: the Mongols. But to most of Hungary's nobility and high clergy, this distant threat felt like a myth wrapped in foreign parchment, something exaggerated by terrified travelers or war-worn merchants. Stories of flaming cities, mountains of skulls, and thundering hooves were passed around at banquets more as curious tales than calls to action. After all, Hungary had its own troubles. Why bother with whispers from far away? The year was 1235. King Béla IV, newly crowned and already under pressure to heal a fractured kingdom, had inherited a land rich in resources but poor in unity. His father, Andrew II, had allowed the power of the monarchy to weaken, granting lands and privileges to the nobility in exchange for loyalty that proved fickle when most needed. Béla, eager to restore the crown's authority, immediately clashed with these same lords, men who were not inclined to yield power they had enjoyed for decades. The country was politically divided. Powerful barons controlled their own territories like petty kings. Communication between regions was poor. Alliances were fragile. Loyalty to the central throne was conditional, negotiated, and transactional. And so, when the first warnings came, fragments of news carried by horsemen from the east, few took them seriously. Perhaps they were too arrogant, or perhaps they were simply tired. Tired of rumors, of chaos, of the constant fear of some distant threat that might never come. The reports, however, were clear. Towns in Rus had been flattened. Entire cities in Central Asia and Eastern Europe had been wiped from the map. The Mongols didn't siege castles in the traditional sense. They surrounded them with speed, terror, and fire, and then they waited. Or they didn't wait. Sometimes they simply rode in. But the stories didn't fit with Hungarian expectations of warfare. The nobles preferred organized conflict, political diplomacy, and slow-moving disputes settled over months or years. The Mongols, however, were something else entirely. Their armies didn't move like armies. They galloped. They struck. They disappeared. And they returned. And still, the court in Esztergom, the royal seat, paid little mind. There were festivals to plan, land disputes to settle, border skirmishes with the Austrians to contain. The Mongols could wait. Béla IV, to his credit, was not entirely blind. As early as 1237, he received a delegation from a Cuman chieftain named Khotin, who came pleading for asylum. The Cumans, a nomadic people from the steppe, had been pushed westward by the Mongol advance and offered military service in exchange for refuge. Béla saw the logic in their offer. He baptized Khotin and his people, integrated them into Hungarian society, at least on paper, and hoped they would form a buffer zone between Hungary and the rising threat. But this, too, provoked discontent. The Cumans were viewed with suspicion. They were different. They didn't farm. They dressed differently. They moved constantly. Rumors spread that they were spies or secret allies of the Mongols. Integration failed. Discontent festered. Nobles refused to cooperate. The king's plan, while far-sighted, was poorly executed and ultimately added more fuel to the domestic fire. Hungary grew more divided. As the years slipped by, the Mongols drew closer. The city of Kiev fell in 1240, just 3 years before the invasion of Hungary. The city, ancient, wealthy, fortified, had been considered unbreakable. It was reduced to ash in weeks. The Dnieper River ran red. Survivors were few. Yet Hungary still did not react. The nobles argued. The church hesitated. The Cumans were blamed for everything that went wrong. And the king, alone, isolated by his attempts at centralization, was unable to enforce the kind of sweeping reforms the crisis demanded. Military command remained decentralized. There were no standing armies. Castles, if they existed, were outdated or privately owned. Villages were spread far apart. Defensive walls were rare. Roads were poorly maintained. Communication between provinces was slow, inconsistent, and often manipulated by local lords to serve their own interests. The kingdom, in short, was a fertile field of disunity, ready to be reaped by a reaper who knew no mercy. Winter came. The year was now 1240, turning to 1241. The ground froze. The forest stood silent under snow. Life slowed, as it always did in winter. But across the Carpathians, something stirred. The Mongols had reached the borders. Scouts appeared like ghosts in the distance. Villagers vanished. Horses were stolen in the night. Roads were found littered with butchered livestock. And still, the Hungarian elite hesitated. Some questioned whether these reports were real or exaggerated. Others blamed the Cumans, accusing them of raiding border settlements. The response was slow, fragmented, and ineffective. Defensive plans were made and unmade. Troops were gathered and scattered. Orders were issued and then revoked. The kingdom's military was not centralized. Commanders acted based on personal loyalty and interest. When Béla called for unity, many lords refused to muster troops, citing old grievances or fears that their rivals would take advantage of their absence. The storm was now visible, but Hungary stood still. The Mongols, under Béla Khan and Subutai, moved methodically. They did not rush. They studied maps. They sent in spies. They mapped rivers, mountain passes, and escape routes. They planned not just a battle, but a total collapse. Their forces did not behave like a European army. No long supply lines, no noble tournaments, no negotiations. Their goal was annihilation. And so, in March of 1241, the storm finally broke. But even then, many in Hungary refused to believe it. When the first cities fell, Galgok, Vac, and eventually Pest, nobles far from the front assumed it was exaggerated. The court still debated strategy while villages burned. It was not until the fields of Mohi, where Béla's forces attempted to make a stand, that reality finally set in. But that moment comes later in the story. For now, we remain in the hours before the nightmare truly begins. Imagine a castle, cold and dim, torches flickering, where an aging lord argues about taxes while just beyond the river, riders from the east watch silently from the trees. Imagine a village preparing for Lent, unaware that it will never see Easter. Imagine a young boy, son of a farmer, watching unfamiliar stars rise in the sky and hearing distant thunder that is not thunder, but hooves. And imagine a king, trapped in duty, haunted by visions, knowing full well the end is coming, and knowing just as well that no one will listen until it is far too late. The storm approaches, yes, but it does not rush. It waits. It watches. And Hungary, divided, distracted, and proud, gives it every chance to enter without resistance. Hungary's weakness was not just its lack of soldiers or walls. It was the refusal to believe that the world was changing. The aristocracy still lived in the patterns of the past, believing that enemies followed rules and traditions. The Mongols did not. Their warfare was not guided by chivalry, nor by Christian codes of honor. They were precise, calculating, and utterly ruthless. They used fear as a weapon, sending messages ahead of their armies to sow terror. In many cases, cities surrendered without a fight. In others, resistance was met with extinction. And yet Hungary thought itself different. Its nobles believed the mountains would protect them. They believed the rivers would slow the enemy. They believed their god would intervene. But faith alone could not stop horsemen who crossed continents. Hope was not a shield. And so, as the kingdom clung to its illusions, the invaders came closer each day, silent, relentless, and entirely unimpressed by the pride of men in stone halls. There is a particular dread in knowing disaster is coming and being unable to stop it. A tension that builds slowly, like smoke before fire. Hungary in 1241 was not unaware of the Mongols. It simply failed to respond. And that failure was more terrifying than ignorance. It was a nation watching a tidal wave from the shore and arguing whether the tide had risen. By the time the water touched their feet, the flood was already unstoppable. Béla IV, though not yet the monster he would become, stood at the center of this paralysis. He saw more clearly than most. He tried to reform. He tried to unify. But he lacked time, authority, and support. Surrounded by rivals and burdened by a broken system, Béla's warnings fell on deaf ears. In a cruel irony, the man who would later be remembered for burning his own cities to resist an invasion began as a king begging his people to take that invasion seriously, and being ignored. And so the storm approached, not with a roar but with silence, building in the distance like a mountain of black clouds. It did not need to rush. It had already won. Hungary had weakened itself. It had divided itself. It had argued, stalled, and doubted until nothing remained but empty prayers and unguarded borders. The nobles would not come together. The bishops would not rally the faithful. The people were left to fend for themselves. And the Mongols, waiting just beyond the ridgeline, prepared to sweep through the land like fire through dry wheat. It would not be a battle. It would be a reckoning. And it began as all great disasters do, with people saying, "Surely it won't come here." There are decisions in history so grim, so drenched in misery, that they echo not with the clang of glory, but with the hollow thud of abandonment. Among such choices stands the infamous decree of King Béla IV of Hungary, an order not to defend his cities, but to destroy them, not to fortify them, but to set them ablaze, not to protect his people, but to drive them into the wilderness, shivering and starving, in the name of strategy. It came with neither grand ceremony nor a council of debate. It came suddenly, decisively, as all terrible commands do, from the lips of one man in a chamber too quiet, where fear had already begun to rot reason. Faced with the imminent advance of the Mongol horde, a force that consumed kingdoms like a flame through dry leaves, Béla IV resolved that if the cities of Hungary were destined to fall, they would fall in smoke and ash, not into the hands of the invaders. His logic, if it could be called that, was simple. The Mongols could not occupy what no longer existed. And so, rather than lose his realm to the enemy, he chose to burn it first. The order spread like a curse across the land. Messengers rode not with hope, but with instructions of doom. In towns like Pest, Esztergom, and Vac, each bustling with merchants, priests, mothers, and sons, word came down from royal authority that the fires must be lit. There would be no defense. There would be no heroic last stand. The people were to leave their homes, gather what they could carry, and flee. What they left behind, houses of timber and stone, chapels with hand-carved altars, granaries stocked for the long winter, was to be consumed in flame. And so it was. Soldiers loyal to the king arrived not with weapons drawn against invaders, but with torches raised against their own. They smashed barrels of oil, tore down doors for kindling, and struck flint against dry hay piled in cellars. In the silence of the hours before dawn, rooftops crackled. Smoke coiled into the sky like a spirit escaping. Entire neighborhoods erupted in sudden orange light. Church bells rang, not to summon aid, but to signal the start of the inferno. One by one, cities once proud of their spires and trade routes were reduced to glowing skeletons of ruin. In Esztergom, the royal chapel burned while a monk wept into a bucket of water too small to douse even a single pew. In Pest, mothers screamed as the walls of their homes collapsed with their children's blankets still inside. In Vac, the flames reached the belfry first, sending its heavy iron bell crashing through the wooden rafters like a funeral drum. Farmers dropped their tools and ran. Bakers abandoned their dough. Children cried out for their toys as they were dragged by the wrist into the dark woods. The fire did not distinguish between the sacred and the profane. Monasteries fell with the same ease as market stalls. Livestock roasted alive in their pens, their screams mixing with the crackle of roof beams snapping in half. The city squares were filled not with soldiers ready for battle, but with terrified civilians watching their lives turn to soot before their eyes. There is a particular cruelty in destruction without war. When a city falls to an enemy, there is at least the twisted justification of conquest. But when it falls to its own king, under orders signed with his own hand, the devastation becomes something else entirely. A betrayal, a horror born not from foreign ambition but from domestic fear. Béla IV did not come to witness the fires. He remained far behind, protected in castles that had yet to be touched by flame. But his spirit was there, in every torch and spark, in every cry of anguish and every pile of scorched belongings. He had not ordered the deaths of his people directly, but death followed his command all the same. For in burning the cities, he had not merely robbed the Mongols of shelter. He had robbed the people of hope, of warmth, of food, of any semblance of protection. He had, in effect, sent them into exile in their own homeland. The timing of the order made the suffering infinitely worse. It was winter, unforgiving, sharp, and relentless. As the fires died down and the ashes settled over the foundations of homes that no longer existed, the survivors found themselves with nowhere to go. The forests were not hospitable. The rivers were frozen. The mountains offered no mercy. Families built crude shelters out of fallen branches, scraps of cloth, and the remnants of burned wagons. Food spoiled quickly in the cold. Water sources froze. Animals either fled or froze to death, their stiff bodies strewn in fields like abandoned relics of a forgotten harvest. Hunger came fast. Disease followed. Entire families huddled together in shallow pits dug beneath trees, hoping their combined body heat would outlast the night. Many did not. Children with cheeks still red from fever were found days later, stiff in their mother's arms. Old men who had once marched in the Crusades now lay dead beside frozen campfires, their swords useless in the face of frost. No one counted the dead. There was no one left with the will to do so. The chroniclers, those ever-faithful servants of royal memory, wrote of the fires in vague, dignified terms: strategic sacrifice, defensive necessity, burnt to preserve the realm. But the peasants who lived it called it something else: madness. And though few dared say it aloud, some whispered that Béla IV was no longer a king, but a butcher hiding behind a crown. His name became a curse passed between clenched teeth, a shadow behind every prayer. For in his desperation to deny the Mongols victory, he had delivered suffering greater than many would ever experience at the hands of the enemy itself. The Mongols, at least, came with certainty. Béla's fire brought confusion, abandonment, and the betrayal of trust between ruler and ruled. And still, the worst had not yet come. The Mongols, far from deterred by the scorched cities, simply moved around them or pressed forward regardless. Ashes did not slow them. They found other routes, other settlements not yet torched, other villages too small to have been included in the grand strategy of destruction. In some cases, they simply waited until the people, starving and broken, wandered back into their own ruins seeking shelter, only to be slaughtered in the blackened remnants of their homes. The scorched earth had not bought Hungary time. It had bought the Mongols a land pre-cleared of resistance, its population scattered and half dead, its infrastructure collapsed, its morale extinguished. And still, Béla IV persisted in his narrative. In letters sent to the Pope, to neighboring kings, and to the few nobles who still dared question him, he defended his actions as the only reasonable choice. He claimed the fires were temporary, that the people would return, that Hungary would rise from the ashes stronger than before. But such promises rang hollow to those who had watched their infants freeze to death beside smoldering stones. There was no strength in starvation. There was no rebirth in ruin. There was only the slow, creeping realization that the king was no longer acting as a protector, but as a force of destruction in his own right. The horror of Béla's scorched earth policy did not lie merely in its violence, but in its calculated nature. This was not chaos, it was cold strategy. The cities were not destroyed by accident or in the fury of battle. They were destroyed by design, according to maps and timetables, under orders bearing the royal seal. The fires were lit at the right times, in the right places, to maximize denial of access. There was no mercy in the method, no flexibility, no second thoughts. It was as if Béla had decided that if he could not save Hungary, he would rather it cease to exist than fall to the enemy. Such thinking does not belong to kings. It belongs to executioners. And so the flames that licked the sky above Pest and Esztergom were not just the death of buildings. They were the death of trust, of safety, of the idea that one's king would defend his people. Béla IV, in his fear, became something worse than the Mongols. He became a destroyer of his own nation. The Mongols had no loyalty to Hungary. They destroyed as outsiders. Béla, however, held the sacred duty of protector, and it was he who struck the match. He who told the people to run, while giving them nowhere to go. He who promised safety in ruin, and delivered only silence and snow. His name, for generations after, would be etched in memory not as a savior, but as a man who mistook terror for strategy. The Hungarian winter passed, but the scars did not. In the blackened ruins of once great towns, the survivors returned slowly, walking carefully through the rubble as if it might speak. Some tried to rebuild. Others could not bear it and moved on, leaving behind burned churches, shattered altars, and walls still warm from remembered flames. The Mongols would come and go, But the memory of the king's fire would remain, smoking quietly beneath the surface of the soil, waiting to be told and retold in the dead of night. For in the end, Béla IV's scorched earth decree did not stop the enemy. It stopped the nation from breathing, from growing, from believing. And as the winds howled across empty fields and frost crept once again into broken homes, the people learned a quiet, final truth: that not all ruin comes from the enemy outside. Sometimes the greatest devastation begins with the signature of a frightened king. The Mongols, led by their unrelenting and merciless commander, swept across the land with a force that left nothing but despair in their wake. Their armies were like a storm, sudden and violent, relentless in their pursuit of destruction. There was no reprieve, no sanctuary. Towns and villages fell as easily as autumn leaves to the ground, trampled underfoot by the hooves of the Mongol cavalry. It was not just the stronghold of armies they sought to conquer, but the very heart of civilization itself. And so, when there was nothing left to capture, when the cities had been reduced to rubble, they turned their fury to the helpless civilians fleeing for their lives. The Mongols, known for their brutal efficiency, turned massacre into a cold, calculating art, wiping out tens of thousands with methodical precision. For the civilians caught in the path of this unstoppable force, there was no escape. Those who managed to flee the flames of their burning homes only found themselves trapped between the fire and the sword. The Mongols, skilled in both archery and swordsmanship, pursued their prey without mercy, picking off the slow, the weak, the desperate, and the innocent. Families were torn apart as they fled, mothers carrying their children in their arms, fathers trying to shield their loved ones from the inevitable end. But there was no protection from the Mongols. They struck like lightning, swift and deadly. Those who were not burned alive in their homes, consumed by the inferno that had swallowed their villages, were butchered in the open fields, their blood staining the earth beneath them. The Mongols didn't care who they killed. The old, the young, the healthy, and the sick all met the same grisly fate. As the carnage continued, the toll of devastation grew immeasurable. Tens of thousands, if not more, perished within the span of mere months. The battlefield was not just a place of armed conflict, but a field of death where anyone could fall, and many did. Some never even saw the face of a Mongol soldier before their lives were extinguished. It wasn't the clash of steel or the sound of war horns that heralded their demise, but the quiet, oppressive silence of a massacre that left no room for hope. In the darkness of their ruined homes and abandoned villages, families were wiped out in an instant, not knowing where the next blow would come from, nor how much longer they had to live. The Mongols showed no mercy. They were not warriors fighting in the heat of battle, but cold executioners, removing all who stood in their way with chilling efficiency. For every life taken, they advanced further, deeper into the heart of what had once been civilization. Their horses galloped across the land, crushing bones and bodies beneath their iron-clad hooves, while the cries of the dying filled the air, only to be drowned out by the sound of war drums, beating like a pulse to the rhythm of death itself. Those who survived the initial onslaught were left to endure the aftermath. The land, once rich with crops and villages, was now a barren wasteland, scarred by the violence and the relentless march of the Mongol horde. The survivors, hollow-eyed and broken, wandered through the ashes of what had once been their homes, searching for any remnants of their former lives. But there was nothing left. Only the desolate landscape stretched before them, a silent testament to the carnage that had unfolded. In the months that followed, the toll continued to mount. The survivors, already ravaged by the horrors they had witnessed, now had to contend with the aftermath of a land destroyed. Famine spread like a disease, as the fields that once provided for the people lay in ruin, unable to nourish those who had survived the sword. With their homes destroyed, their families torn apart, and their spirits broken, the survivors became shadows of their former selves. And all the while, the Mongols pressed forward, unyielding and unstoppable, leaving nothing but death and ruin in their wake. The collapse of civilization, the total annihilation of what had once been a thriving society, was a horror beyond comprehension. It wasn't just the loss of life that was so devastating, but the utter erasure of the world that had existed before. The Mongols had not simply killed their enemies. They had wiped away entire cultures, histories, and ways of life, leaving only a void where there had once been hope. For those who survived, the world they returned to was unrecognizable. What was once familiar had become strange, hostile, and foreign, consumed by the fires of war and the cold hand of Mongol destruction. As the months wore on, the devastation began to settle into the land like a thick fog. The bodies, once scattered across the earth, now lay in mass graves, forgotten by time but forever etched into the memories of the few who had lived through it. The sound of war drums had faded into silence, but the damage they had done could not be undone. The blood of the fallen soaked into the earth, and in its place, a sorrowful stillness lingered, the remnants of lives lost in a conflict that had spared no one. The land had been ravaged, the people left to mourn their dead and pick up the pieces of their shattered world. But the Mongols were not finished. For them, this was merely the beginning. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless, their thirst for conquest unquenchable. The fall of one city was only the prelude to the fall of another. As the survivors of the massacre stumbled through the ashes of their former lives, they knew that their world had changed forever, that the nightmare of Mongol invasion would haunt them for generations to come. And so, the carnage continued, the Mongol onslaught sweeping across the land, leaving a trail of death and devastation in its wake. For those caught in its path, there was no salvation. There was only the fire, the sword, and the cold, indifferent efficiency of the Mongol horde. In the end, there was only ruin. As the fires of destruction consumed the kingdom, Béla, the king of the land, did what many expected of a ruler in desperate times. He fled. His kingdom, torn apart by the savage Mongol onslaught, was crumbling under the weight of war. The once thriving cities, filled with the bustle of daily life, had been reduced to smoldering ruins, their towering walls now nothing more than broken stones and ashes. The people, caught between the unyielding force of the Mongols and the oppressive terror that followed in their wake, were left to suffer and die. The cries of the dying echoed through the desolate countryside, a mournful symphony of despair. And while the land burned and bled, its king, the supposed protector of his people, turned his back on the horrors unfolding before him. Béla's retreat was not a hasty decision, nor was it an unthinking one. It was a calculated move, a desperate attempt to save himself, and by extension, his throne. Dalmatia, a distant region far from the carnage that had consumed his kingdom, promised sanctuary. The coastal lands were still untouched by the Mongol advance, and in the eyes of the king, they represented a lifeline, a chance to regroup and seek the foreign aid he so desperately needed. But as Béla crossed the border and left his people behind, the very foundation of his rule began to crack. His departure would not be seen as an act of strategic retreat, but as a cowardly abandonment, a betrayal of the trust his subjects had placed in him. To the common folk, he was no longer a king. He was a man who had fled the battle, a monarch who had chosen self-preservation over the lives of those he was sworn to protect. For Béla, the journey to Dalmatia was one of stark contrast. The further he traveled from the burning wreckage of his kingdom, the more the weight of his own decisions seemed to lessen. In the safety of foreign lands, he could hear no cries of the suffering, no wails of the widows and orphans left in the wake of the Mongol destruction. It was as if he had stepped into another world, one untouched by the devastation that had ravaged his own. Here, he could seek aid from distant powers, gather forces to reclaim his throne, and restore order to the realm. But the people back home were not so fortunate. While Béla sat comfortably, speaking with foreign dignitaries and plotting his return, the kingdom he had once ruled continued to burn, its streets running with blood, its people perishing without hope. As news of the king's flight spread across the land, the perception of betrayal began to take root. The people, already devastated by the horrors of war, now faced the crushing reality that their king had abandoned them in their darkest hour. They had trusted him, looked to him for guidance and protection, but he had turned his back on them. And so, the cries of anger and resentment began to rise, as the people who had once revered their king now saw him as nothing more than a coward. His absence, once thought to be temporary, became a symbol of his failure, a mark of his lack of courage. In the eyes of the common folk, Béla was no longer their king. He was an outsider, a man who had placed his own survival above the lives of his people. In the midst of the flames and bloodshed, he had chosen to run. As the days passed and Béla's retreat became more widely known, the perception of his cowardice only grew stronger. To the soldiers who had fought for him, to the families who had lost loved ones in the Mongol onslaught, his disappearance was a bitter pill to swallow. It was not just the loss of the kingdom that hurt, it was the loss of their faith in their ruler. The king, the very symbol of their strength and unity, had fled, and in doing so, he had shattered their trust. The people, once proud of their king, now saw him as a traitor, a man unworthy of the throne he had once held. And as the fires continued to rage, as the death toll mounted and the suffering grew, Béla remained far from the destruction, wrapped in the comfort of foreign lands, a king in name alone. But in Dalmatia, the king did not find the peace he had hoped for. While he sought to gather forces, to build alliances with foreign powers, he could not escape the growing shame that clung to him like a dark cloud. The whispers of betrayal followed him wherever he went. Foreign lords, once eager to offer their support, now looked at him with suspicion, wondering whether they were backing a lost cause. The king, so eager to escape the wrath of the Mongols, had left behind not only his people, but the very dignity of his throne. His actions, once deemed necessary by some, had now become a stain on his reputation that he could not erase. In his solitude, Béla was forced to confront the reality of his flight. He had abandoned his kingdom, his people, and his honor, and now, even with foreign aid on the horizon, he could not escape the weight of his own decisions. The king who had once stood tall and proud now found himself diminished, a man whose legacy would be forever marked by the cowardice of his retreat. And as he sat in foreign courts, surrounded by advisors and allies, he could not shake the image of the people he had left behind, dying in the streets, their lives extinguished by the Mongol onslaught. Every day that passed was a reminder of his failure, a reminder of the trust he had betrayed. Back in the kingdom, the people continued to suffer. The fires had not yet burned out, the blood had not yet dried, and the destruction continued unabated. And with each passing day, the anger towards their king grew, for the man who had been their protector had chosen to flee. The memory of Béla's flight was seared into their minds, a symbol of his failure to stand by them when they needed him most. His absence was not just physical. It was a deep wound in the soul of the kingdom, one that would take years, if not generations, to heal. The king who had once been the pride of the land was now a figure of scorn, a man who had abandoned his own people in their time of need. In Dalmatia, Béla may have found safety, but he found no solace. His once proud rule had crumbled, and with it, the respect of his people. The monarch who had once commanded armies and led his people to victory was now a figure of pity and disgrace. And as the years passed, his name, once spoken with reverence, became synonymous with cowardice and betrayal. The people would never forget the day their king turned his back on them, and they would never forgive him for the suffering they endured in his absence. The kingdom that had once been united under Béla's rule was now fractured, its people scattered and broken. The fires of war had burned away more than just homes. They had burned away the very spirit of the land. The king who had been their protector had become their greatest failure. And as the months turned into years, the shadow of Béla's retreat would loom over the kingdom forever, a reminder of the man who fled when his people needed him most. In 1242, when the Mongols suddenly withdrew from Hungary, it was not the triumph of a noble victory or the sound of joyous celebration that followed. Instead, it was the eerie stillness of a shattered land, as though the very life force had been sucked out of it, leaving only a ghostly emptiness in its wake. It was a retreat born not of defeat, but of necessity, an abrupt and cold decision driven by a death far removed from the chaos of the battlefield. The death of Ogedei, the great Khan. His passing marked the end of the Mongol campaign in Hungary, but for the land and its people, it was the beginning of a long and grim silence, one that spoke louder than any battle cry or victory cheer ever could. The Mongols, known for their brutal conquests and merciless campaigns, were an unstoppable force. Under the leadership of Béla Khan and Subutai, they had swept across Hungary like a plague of locusts, laying waste to everything in their path. Towns were razed, villages burned, and thousands were slaughtered in the most horrific ways imaginable. The Mongols showed no mercy, sparing neither the old nor the young, the innocent nor the guilty. Their methods were cruel and efficient. No one was safe from their savage wrath. Those who fled from the Mongol armies were met with death in the open fields, shot down by arrows before they could escape. The burning of villages was followed by the systematic slaughter of civilians, and the fields were left empty, devoid of life. By the time the Mongols decided to withdraw, Hungary had become a place where the only sounds were the winds passing through empty ruins and the occasional distant cry of a survivor, lost and alone. The death of Ogedei, the son of Genghis Khan, changed the course of the Mongol invasion in Europe. His passing demanded the immediate return of the Mongol leaders to the Mongol heartlands for a council to elect a new great Khan. As such, their previously relentless advance came to an abrupt halt. With the same swiftness with which they had arrived, the Mongols packed up their camps and began their withdrawal. Their departure was not heralded by any retreating troops or any grand farewell. There was no victory parade, no parting shots fired. The Mongols simply vanished from Hungary, leaving behind the wreckage of their conquest. Their sudden exit, as mysterious as their invasion, left the people in a state of profound disbelief. It was as though they had come out of nowhere, destroying everything in their path, and then just as suddenly they were gone. The survivors, left in a world forever altered, had no explanation for the strange cessation of the carnage. They were left in the chilling quiet, surrounded by nothing but the aftermath of the Mongol storm. What remained of Hungary was a land utterly decimated. The once thriving villages were now little more than smoldering piles of ash. The cities that had withstood centuries of conflict lay in ruins, their stone walls cracked and broken, their streets littered with debris. The people, who had once lived their lives under the security of their kings and lords, were now nothing more than lost souls wandering through the wreckage of their homes. Some had been fortunate enough to escape the Mongols' wrath, but many had not. The dead were everywhere, lying in heaps along the streets, their bodies forgotten and ignored. In the silence that followed the Mongols' retreat, the survivors had no energy left for mourning. They had witnessed horrors beyond comprehension, and now, in the stillness, they could only begin to comprehend the scale of the destruction. The survivors who managed to cling to life were broken, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Those who had lost loved ones in the fighting or in the cruel massacres could not bring themselves to speak of what had happened. The fear, the shock, and the unrelenting despair had become too much to bear. In the absence of the Mongol forces, their world had collapsed inward, leaving them to endure the quiet devastation of their once vibrant land. The landscape itself was marred by the destruction of the Mongol invasion. Fields that had once been lush and fertile were now barren, the crops consumed by fire or trampled underfoot by the Mongol cavalry. The villages, which had once been the lifeblood of the land, were nothing but charred remnants. The people who had lived in these places were now scattered to the wind, wandering aimlessly, unsure of where to go or what to do. The earth itself seemed to mourn the loss of life, the once productive soil now reduced to a desolate, empty expanse, incapable of sustaining the survivors. The once beautiful landscape, filled with the sounds of nature and the hum of life, was now quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that would stir the dust and ashes in the streets. It was as if the land itself had been drained of all its vitality, leaving behind only a haunting void that served as a grim reminder of the devastation. The survivors of the Mongol onslaught were left to rebuild their lives in the face of overwhelming odds. They had lost everything: their homes, their families, their livelihoods, and their dignity. What remained was a shattered society, its people stripped of their former sense of security and safety. They had been left to survive in a land where trust had been broken, and where every corner seemed to hold the specter of death. The survivors who had not been physically harmed by the Mongols now had to grapple with the mental and emotional scars of their experience. Many had seen their loved ones killed, their homes burned, and their communities destroyed. Others had been forced to live through days of unimaginable suffering, hiding in fear from the Mongol invaders, only to emerge into a world where nothing was left to cling to. For those who had survived, life would never be the same again. The Mongols had left no trace of themselves behind, save for the devastation they had wrought. There were no banners left fluttering in the wind, no Mongol soldiers guarding the roads, and no indication of their presence. Their retreat had been as sudden and as mysterious as their arrival, leaving the people to wonder whether they had ever truly been there at all. And yet, the scars of their passing were all too real, etched into the very fabric of the land and its people. The survivors, those few who remained, were left to pick up the pieces of their broken world. They would have to rebuild from the ground up, starting with the most basic of necessities: food, shelter, and safety. But even as they worked to restore their lives, the memories of the Mongol invasion would linger, a dark cloud that would hang over them for generations to come. In the years that followed, Hungary would struggle to recover from the devastation wrought by the Mongols. The land was left in ruins, its people broken and scarred. The invasion had stripped away any semblance of peace, leaving in its place a profound sense of loss and hopelessness. The once thriving kingdom had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self, and the task of rebuilding seemed insurmountable. The wounds inflicted by the Mongols would not easily heal, and the trauma endured by the survivors would remain a part of the land's history for centuries. It was a history marked by destruction, by the sudden withdrawal of an unstoppable force, and by the haunting silence that followed in its wake. The Mongols, though gone from Hungary, had left behind a legacy of fear, death, and desolation. Their retreat, in the end, was not a moment of peace or a triumph of survival. It was a retreat into the unknown, and what they left behind was not a restored land, but a broken, empty shell of what it had once been. In the silence that followed, there was no comfort, only the grim reality of a kingdom left in ruins. A kingdom whose people had paid the price for a conflict that they could neither avoid nor understand. The Mongols had withdrawn, but the scars of their invasion would linger for generations to come. Béla IV, the king who had once abandoned his kingdom to the Mongols, returned to Hungary in a much-changed state. The land, still reeling from the devastation of the invasion, was a shadow of its former self. Its cities lay in ruins, its people shattered by grief and despair, and its once thriving economy now a mere memory. But Béla's return was not a triumphant return to a realm longing for its king. It was the arrival of a monarch who sought not to heal, but to exact retribution. With cold eyes and a heart hardened by his own retreat, Béla claimed the throne once more. He did so not as a leader returning to save his people, but as a man intent on restoring his power, imposing his authority, and punishing those he deemed responsible for the fall of his kingdom. Béla, once seen as a coward who had fled in the face of danger, now returned as the self-proclaimed restorer of Hungary. But his restoration was not one of peace or prosperity. It was a return to ruthless dominance, fueled by anger, fear, and the bitter taste of betrayal. The people, already broken by the horrors they had endured, would soon learn that their king had come back not to lead, but to reign with a cruel, iron fist. The moment Béla set foot in Hungary, the shadow of his anger began to cast over the land. The survivors, who had managed to rebuild even the smallest fragments of their lives, found themselves caught in a storm of retribution. Béla's return was not accompanied by an offer of peace or reconciliation. Instead, it was marked by a brutal purge of those who had survived the Mongol invasion. The king wasted no time in shifting blame, holding the nobles and leaders of his kingdom accountable for what had happened during his absence. His accusations were harsh and unforgiving. He charged them with failing to defend the nation, with abandoning their king and their people in their hour of need. These noblemen, who had been forced to watch their homes and lands burn to the ground, now found themselves in the king's crosshairs, their every action scrutinized and condemned. They were no longer seen as loyal subjects of a once noble kingdom, but as traitors who had not done enough to protect their land. Béla, with his eyes filled with contempt, moved quickly to strip these men of their titles, their lands, and their wealth. In his mind, they had failed him, and in his eyes, failure was punishable by loss. But for those who dared to speak out, for those who protested against Béla's harsh judgments, the king's wrath was swift and final. Béla's retribution was not just a matter of stripping lands or revoking titles. It was a cruel, violent purge. Those who dared to challenge him, to question his authority, were met with imprisonment, torture, and death. Béla's return to the throne marked the beginning of a reign built on fear, where no one was safe from the king's judgment. The prisons soon became filled with dissenters, those who had dared to speak out against the king's decisions or who had been unlucky enough to fall under his suspicion. Executions were carried out with chilling regularity, and Béla seemed to take a dark pleasure in watching his enemies fall. His vengeance was relentless and unforgiving, and soon, whispers of his ruthlessness spread across the land, adding to the terror that already gripped the survivors. The people, who had once been grateful for his return, now found themselves living under a reign that was as cruel as the Mongol invasion itself. Under the guise of restoring Hungary, Béla had begun to rebuild it in his own image. A kingdom ruled by fear, where survival depended on loyalty to the king and silence in the face of his tyranny. The political purges that followed Béla's return were not just about punishing the guilty. They were a means to solidify his own power. Every noble, every leader, and every dissenter who stood in his way was targeted, their wealth and influence stripped away in a swift and brutal manner. Béla sought to surround himself with those who would not challenge him, those who would bow to his every command and offer him unwavering loyalty. But loyalty, in Béla's eyes, was earned through fear, not trust. He believed that only through the total destruction of any opposition could his reign be truly secure. And so, he began to rebuild his kingdom by tearing down everything that had once stood in his way. The purges spread through every level of society. Nobles were executed, their families left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Entire estates were seized, their wealth redistributed to those loyal to Béla. The country, already ravaged by war, was now being torn apart from within, as the political landscape shifted into one of ruthless control. The king's vengeance did not stop at those who had once been his enemies. It extended to anyone who could potentially pose a threat to his power. Even those who had remained loyal to him were forced to prove their allegiance time and time again, for Béla trusted no one completely. Every whisper of dissent was met with swift punishment, and any hint of disloyalty was dealt with in the most brutal way imaginable. As Béla's reign continued, the landscape of Hungary shifted. The remnants of the once proud noble families were crushed under his heel, their titles and estates erased from history. The king's rule was built not on justice, but on fear and submission. Those who survived the purge lived in constant dread of what would happen next, wondering when the king's wrath would turn on them. The whispers of Béla's cruelty echoed through the streets, as his enemies, both real and imagined, were hunted down and destroyed. He had created a world where loyalty was not a matter of honor, but of survival. The people, already exhausted by the horrors of war, now found themselves living in a kingdom where the fear of their ruler's judgment overshadowed every aspect of their lives. Under Béla's iron rule, Hungary was no longer a land of hope or possibility. It was a place where betrayal, no matter how small, could lead to a swift and violent death. The king's reign was marked by a series of harsh decisions, each one more ruthless than the last. Béla did not seek to rebuild Hungary in the traditional sense. Instead, he sought to establish a kingdom that was wholly his own. A kingdom where fear was the greatest currency and obedience the highest virtue. Those who survived the initial purges found themselves living in a state of constant vigilance, their lives dictated by the whims of a king who cared little for their suffering. The kingdom, once a place of vibrant life and culture, now felt like a prison. The air was thick with suspicion, and the streets were filled with silent, fearful people who knew that their every move could be watched and reported. The once thriving cities had become places of bleakness and oppression, their former beauty masked by the heavy hand of Béla's tyranny. The king, with his cold, unforgiving nature, had created a world where only the loyal survived, and where every act of rebellion was met with swift, violent retribution. There was no room for mercy, no place for compassion. Béla ruled with the certainty of a man who knew that in order to hold on to power, he had to crush anyone who dared to stand against him. In the years that followed Béla's return, the kingdom remained under the iron grip of a ruler who had no intention of forgiving or forgetting. The purges continued, each one more destructive than the last, as the king sought to rid Hungary of any remaining vestiges of opposition. His legacy, built on fear and violence, was one that would be remembered for centuries to come. Béla's rule was not one of justice or rebuilding. It was a reign of terror, where loyalty was demanded at the cost of life itself. The once proud nation of Hungary had become a shadow of its former self, its people broken and terrified, ruled by a king whose only loyalty was to his own power. And so, under Béla IV, Hungary became a kingdom where the weight of fear pressed down upon every soul, where survival depended not on strength or wisdom, but on one's ability to bend to the will of a ruthless king. In the aftermath of the Mongol invasion, Hungary lay in ruin, a desolate wasteland where once thriving cities and villages had been swallowed by fire and bloodshed. The survivors, those few who remained after the devastation, were left with nothing but the ruins of their homes, the memories of their lost families, and the grim task of rebuilding. But the king, Béla IV, demanded that the kingdom be restored. He saw the ruined land as a symbol of his own fractured rule, and in his mind, rebuilding would not only restore the land, but also solidify his control. Yet the rebuilding was not a noble endeavor. It was a dark and cruel process that saw the remnants of the kingdom laboring under the weight of their sorrow and despair. The survivors, prisoners, and orphans who were spared from the slaughter now found themselves trapped in a new form of torment. They were forced to rebuild their shattered cities using nothing but their bare hands and the charred remains of what had once been their homes. The task was unimaginable, but it was one they were compelled to carry out, for to refuse meant death. Those who had survived the Mongol onslaught now found themselves caught in the jaws of a different kind of hell, one crafted not by foreign invaders, but by their very own king. The conditions under which the survivors labored were nothing short of inhuman. The land was choked with ash, the air thick with the smell of death. Construction took place in the midst of rotting corpses, their decaying bodies left where they had fallen, unburied, a constant reminder of the violence that had torn through the land. The survivors worked amid the stench of death, their every step taken in the shadow of the mangled remains of their families and neighbors. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily silent, save for the sound of the survivors' labored breathing as they moved the rubble. There was no time for grief, no time for mourning. The king's orders were clear: rebuild or face the same fate as the dead. The survivors, whether they were former farmers, soldiers, or merchants, were now nothing more than tools in the king's grim project of restoration. Their hands, once used for more noble purposes, now scraped and clawed at the charred rubble, desperate to unearth something that could be used to rebuild the homes and cities that had been taken from them. Every day, the survivors toiled under the sun, their bodies weakened from hunger and exhaustion, their spirits crushed under the weight of their task. The conditions were beyond cruel, but they were made even more unbearable by the relentless presence of death. The bodies of the fallen, some of them still identifiable as those who had once lived in the town, littered the streets. The survivors, as they worked to rebuild their homes, could not escape the grim reminder of what they had lost. They stepped over the remains of their friends and family, their faces and bodies already twisted by the ravages of time and decay. The air was filled with the constant scent of rot, and the ground beneath them was soft with the remains of those who had perished in the invasion. Yet there was no reprieve, no moment to pause and reflect. The king demanded that the land be restored, and so the survivors worked, slowly, painfully, and with a sense of hopelessness that grew with each passing day. In this grim landscape of destruction and despair, the survivors began to rebuild, not out of hope or ambition, but out of fear and necessity. The towns, once filled with the sounds of life and laughter, now rose again from the ashes, but they did so with an air of desolation that permeated every stone and every building. The homes, rebuilt from the rubble, stood as hollow monuments to the suffering that had taken place. They were not homes of joy or peace. They were simply structures, created to appease the demands of a king who cared little for the lives of those who lived within them. The survivors, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, moved through the streets as ghosts of their former selves, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed and the pain of what they had lost. They had once been proud, strong individuals, but now they were nothing more than broken shells, their spirits crushed by the weight of their labor and the grief that gnawed at them from within. And yet, despite the grim conditions, the rebuilding went on. The towns began to rise once more, brick by brick, stone by stone, but with them came something far darker than the physical labor of construction. As the towns took shape, so too did the despair that had taken root in the hearts of the survivors. The people did not rebuild with hope or determination. They rebuilt out of fear and resignation. There was no joy in the process, no sense of accomplishment. Every brick placed, every wall raised, was a reminder of what had been lost, of the lives that had been taken, and the world that had been destroyed. The survivors could not escape the shadow of death that loomed over them. It followed them as they worked, a constant presence that served as a reminder that no matter how much they rebuilt, the land they once knew was gone forever. The homes they created, the cities they restored, were not places of refuge or sanctuary. They were mere shells of what had once been, hollow and empty, filled with the ghosts of the past. The king, Béla IV, watched as the towns slowly began to take shape, but there was no joy in his heart for the restoration of his kingdom. He cared little for the suffering of his people. To him, the rebuilding was not about healing the wounds of the land. It was about reasserting his power, about forcing the survivors to bow to his will. The survivors were nothing more than tools in his eyes, instruments to be used in the construction of a kingdom that was once again under his control. The laborers, the prisoners, and the orphans who worked tirelessly in the shadow of death were expendable, mere cogs in a machine that he had set into motion. Their pain, their exhaustion, and their despair meant nothing to him. All that mattered was that the kingdom was restored, that the land was rebuilt, and that his power was solidified. The towns, now rising from the ashes, were nothing more than grim reminders of the price of survival. They were not places of hope. They were places of survival, where the people lived not for joy, but for mere existence. The survivors, those few who managed to endure the labor, now lived in these empty, lifeless homes, haunted by the memories of their lost loved ones and the horrors they had witnessed. The rebuilding, far from offering them a chance at renewal, only served to deepen the wound of their loss. There was no joy in the streets, no laughter to be heard. The survivors moved through the town like shadows, their faces gaunt and their eyes empty, as though the very essence of life had been drained from them during the rebuilding process. In the end, the kingdom was restored, but it was a kingdom without life, without light. The towns that had risen from the ashes were filled with the remnants of the past. Empty homes, broken spirits, and a constant, ever-present sense of despair. The survivors, having rebuilt the land, now found themselves trapped in a world where there was no room for healing, no room for hope. The king, who had demanded the restoration of the land, had succeeded in rebuilding a kingdom, but in doing so, he had destroyed the very soul of the people who lived within it. The people, once vibrant and full of life, had been reduced to mere shells, their hearts heavy with grief, and their minds consumed by the memories of death and destruction. The land, though physically restored, was still haunted by the shadow of the past, a past that would never be forgotten. The survivors, forced to rebuild amidst rotting corpses and ash-filled ruins, had found no respite, no peace. They had rebuilt, but they had done so in the shadow of death, and the resurrection of their towns only served to reinforce the hopelessness that had taken root in their hearts. The king's kingdom was restored, but the price of that restoration had been the very essence of life itself. The cities of Hungary, once filled with life, now stood reborn in the wake of Béla IV's harsh rule. But there was little joy to be found in their resurrection. The streets, once bustling with people, were now filled with only the faintest echoes of the past. The walls of the cities, newly erected, stood as cold, silent sentinels, their stone faces devoid of the warmth and life that had once characterized them. The rebuilding had not brought a sense of hope or renewal to the land. Instead, it had created a kingdom of shadows, a place where the spirit had been drained and only the cold, lifeless structures remained. The homes that had been rebuilt, though standing tall once again, were empty and void of the laughter, the chatter, and the voices of families who had once filled them. These homes, constructed with sweat and blood, were nothing more than shells, empty vessels that had no warmth, no love, no life to offer. The people who lived in these homes, the survivors who had endured the horrors of the Mongol invasion and the brutal purges of their king, moved through their days as though they were merely passing time in a world that had already lost its meaning. The streets, once filled with the vibrant energy of everyday life, now stood still, devoid of song, of music, of the very essence of what it meant to be alive. The joy that had once echoed through the land was now nothing more than a distant memory, a ghost that haunted the empty cities, whispering of a time when things had been different, when the world had been full of hope and possibility. But that time was gone, and in its place, there was only the silence of a kingdom left to mourn its own existence. As the cities were rebuilt, so too was the society that had once flourished within them. But Béla IV's vision of restoration was not one of equality or unity. It was one of division, of a society split in two, with the powerful and the powerless living side by side, but in separate worlds. The king's rebuilding efforts favored the nobles who had supported him, those who had been loyal to him during his absence, and had helped him reclaim his throne. These men and women, whose wealth and influence had been protected and even strengthened by Béla, found themselves rewarded with vast estates, privileges, and power. They were the ones who benefited most from the king's return, and they quickly resumed their positions of dominance over the land. For them, the rebuilding of Hungary was a time of prosperity, a time when they could reassert their control over the land and its people. They were the ones who lived in the newly constructed homes, the ones who dined in the finest halls, the ones who dictated the course of the kingdom's future. Béla, with his cold and calculating nature, had no interest in the welfare of the common people. To him, they were mere tools to be used, pawns in a game of power that he alone controlled. The nobles, ever loyal to the king, were rewarded with the spoils of war, while the commoners, the survivors of the invasion, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The common people, those who had borne the brunt of the Mongol invasion and had been forced to rebuild their world from the ground up, found themselves in an even worse position than before. While the nobles flourished under Béla's rule, the commoners were left exposed, voiceless, and vulnerable. They were the ones who had to toil in the fields, who had to scrape by with the barest of necessities, while the nobles lived in luxury. The gap between the two classes grew wider with each passing day, and the common people began to realize that their king, the very man who had promised to restore the land, had no interest in their welfare. Béla's rebuilding efforts had left them with nothing but empty homes, empty streets, and empty promises. They had worked tirelessly to rebuild the cities, to restore what had been lost, but in the end, their efforts had been for nothing. They had been left with nothing but the weight of their own survival, nothing but the burden of living in a world that no longer cared for them. The nobles, who had once been no different from the commoners, were now elevated above them, their wealth and power serving as a constant reminder of the vast chasm that separated the two classes. The common people, who had once been the lifeblood of the kingdom, were now nothing more than shadows in their own land, their voices drowned out by the cries of those who held power. The two-tiered society that Béla had created was a kingdom built on fear and inequality, where the rich and powerful lived in comfort, while the poor and powerless struggled to survive. The noble families, whose fortunes had been restored by the king, found themselves at the top of the social hierarchy, their wealth and influence growing with each passing year. They were the ones who dictated the laws, the ones who decided who would live and who would die, the ones who controlled every aspect of life in Hungary. For them, life had returned to normal. They were no longer the ones who had been humiliated, the ones who had been forced to bow before the Mongols. Now they were the ones who held all the power, the ones who could shape the future of the kingdom as they saw fit. Béla had given them the means to reassert their dominance, and they took full advantage of it. They built grand estates, hosted lavish feasts, and surrounded themselves with wealth and luxury. For them, the rebuilding of Hungary was a time of celebration, a time to bask in the glory of their restored power. But for the common people, it was a time of sorrow, a time of struggle, and a time of hopelessness. They had worked tirelessly to rebuild the land, but now they found themselves living in a world where their voices were silenced, their needs ignored, and their lives worth little more than the labor they could provide. Béla's vision of restoration was a kingdom built on a foundation of fear and inequality. The king had created a world where the powerful were protected, and the powerless were forgotten. The common people, who had once been the heart of Hungary, were now nothing more than laborers, forced to work for the benefit of the nobles and the king. They had no voice, no power, and no means of improving their lives. They were forced to live in the shadows of the noble families, their lives a constant struggle for survival. The homes they had rebuilt were empty of joy, for there was no happiness to be found in a world that had been divided so cruelly. The streets were empty of song, for there was no music to be heard in a land where the rich thrived and the poor withered. The towns may have risen from the ashes, but they had not been reborn in any true sense. They were still the same empty places, the same lifeless cities, filled with the ghosts of the past. The common people, who had once filled the streets with their laughter and song, now moved through the towns like shadows, their faces hollow, their eyes vacant. The hope that had once existed in the land was now gone, replaced by the cold reality of a kingdom ruled by fear and greed. Béla IV's kingdom, though restored in name, had become a kingdom of ghosts. The spirit of the land, the joy and vitality that had once defined Hungary, had been erased by the king's ruthless policies. The rebuilding, though physical, had done nothing to heal the wounds that ran deep in the hearts of the people. The commoners, who had worked so hard to restore what had been lost, now found themselves living in a world where they had no place, no future, and no voice. The nobles, ever loyal to the king, had risen to power, but their power came at the cost of the very people they had once been. The kingdom may have been restored, but in the process, it had lost its soul. The people who had once made Hungary a vibrant, living land were now nothing more than ghosts, haunting the streets of their own cities, their voices lost to the winds. The joy, the laughter, the music, all that had once filled the air, was now nothing more than a memory, a distant echo of a time that had long since passed. The kingdom of Hungary, reborn from the ashes, was now a place where the living could no longer find life, and the dead could no longer find peace. Béla IV's reign in Hungary, once marked by a desperate attempt to reclaim his kingdom from the Mongol onslaught, slowly transformed into something far more sinister and oppressive. What began as the struggle of a monarch seeking to restore his realm after a devastating invasion evolved into a cruel and calculating tyrant's rule. Béla, who had once been seen as a victim of fate, as a ruler who had been forced into exile, now stood at the helm of a nation that was rebuilt not by the strength of its people, but through fear, manipulation, and oppression. His transformation from a desperate ruler to a cold tyrant was not a mere change in leadership style, but a complete moral and ethical decline that seeped into every corner of his regime. As Hungary slowly recovered from the ashes of war, Béla's control over the land grew more absolute. The suffering of the people, which had initially been a catalyst for his return to power, was now used as a tool to further tighten his grip on the kingdom. The disasters, both natural and man-made, that had plagued Hungary were now framed as the very reasons for Béla's firm control. He portrayed himself as the sole figure capable of leading the nation through its troubled times, manipulating the pain of the people into a justification for his increasingly authoritarian rule. Béla's use of disaster to consolidate power was an artifice of self-preservation and ruthlessness. When the Mongols had ravaged the land, Béla had fled in fear, leaving his people to fend for themselves. But now, having returned to reclaim his throne, Béla saw the opportunity to not only rebuild his kingdom, but to reshape it entirely. The destruction caused by the invasion, the famine, and the subsequent suffering of the Hungarian people were all woven into Béla's narrative of rebirth. He claimed that only through his rule could the kingdom recover, and that the destruction had, in a twisted sense, paved the way for a stronger, more unified Hungary. The idea of national rebirth, which was supposed to inspire hope and resilience, instead became a weapon that Béla wielded with growing cruelty. He constructed a narrative where Hungary's suffering and his own return were intimately connected. The people, who had endured the horrors of the Mongol invasion, now found themselves trapped in the clutches of a king who viewed their pain not as a call for mercy or compassion, but as a means to further entrench his own power. Béla's reign, marked by his unyielding desire for control, was one that would require the submission of all, the eradication of any opposition, and the complete and utter suppression of any voice that dared to challenge his authority. Béla's transformation from a monarch seeking justice for his kingdom to a ruthless oppressor did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, one that began with small, seemingly innocent actions that slowly grew into a complete dismantling of personal freedoms. In the early years of his reign, Béla promised a return to order, to justice, and to the rebuilding of Hungary. He used the rhetoric of restoration to gain the loyalty of those around him, appealing to the remnants of the old nobility who had been spared during the invasions. He promised them power and security, a chance to restore what had been lost. But as Béla's grip on the kingdom tightened, the promises of a free and just society became mere words. What followed was a regime defined by control, surveillance, and ruthless suppression of dissent. Béla's tactics for maintaining power were as insidious as they were effective. He enacted laws that gave him unprecedented control over the lives of his people, claiming that these measures were necessary for the rebirth of Hungary. But the truth was far darker. He used the fear of rebellion, the shadow of foreign invasions, and the constant threat of unrest as excuses to crush any opposition before it could even take root. The people, who had already lost so much, found themselves living under the weight of constant surveillance, their every move scrutinized by the king's enforcers. Béla's use of fear to maintain control was methodical and deliberate. His spies infiltrated every level of society, from the highest noble courts to the poorest villages. No one was safe from suspicion, and anyone who dared to speak out against the king's policies was swiftly silenced. The nobility, once a powerful force in Hungarian politics, found themselves subjugated by the king's unyielding authority. Those who had supported Béla during his return were rewarded, but even they lived in fear, for Béla's paranoia knew no bounds. No one could be trusted, and loyalty was demanded with a level of intensity that bordered on madness. The king surrounded himself with a small group of loyal advisors, people who would not question him, who would carry out his commands without hesitation. These advisors became the tools of Béla's tyranny, helping to implement his vision of a kingdom governed by fear and oppression. The people, once hopeful that their monarch would restore peace and prosperity, now found themselves living in a kingdom where the very notion of freedom was nothing more than a distant dream. The moral and ethical decline of Béla's regime was not just about the physical control he exercised over his people, but about the erosion of values that had once defined Hungarian society. His reign was marked by the gradual dismantling of any semblance of justice. The king, who had once been seen as a defender of the people, now became a figure of terror. He ruled with an iron fist, making decisions that affected the lives of his subjects without their consent, without their voice, and without regard for their welfare. Béla justified his actions with the rhetoric of national rebirth, claiming that the suffering of the people was necessary for their ultimate redemption. The ethical decline of his rule was reflected in the ways in which he treated his own people, turning a blind eye to their suffering as long as they remained obedient. It became clear that Béla's idea of national rebirth was not one that involved the healing of the people or the restoration of their rights. It was one that centered on the king's absolute control, the destruction of dissent, and the eradication of any force that could threaten his reign. Béla's control extended beyond political purges and surveillance. He sought to suppress every form of dissent, not only through violence and intimidation, but also through the manipulation of public opinion. He used propaganda to shape the narrative of Hungary's rebirth, ensuring that no alternative voices could gain traction. Any form of rebellion, whether it be in the form of a small uprising or a whispered criticism, was met with swift and brutal retaliation. Béla created a system where fear was not just a byproduct of his rule, but its very foundation. The people were made to believe that any form of resistance would lead to their destruction, and that their only hope of survival lay in submission to the king's will. Béla's tactics were cruel in their simplicity. Through the careful cultivation of fear, he transformed Hungary into a kingdom where the very air seemed thick with suspicion and dread. There was no place for joy, no space for peace, no room for freedom. The people lived in constant anxiety, their lives dictated by the whims of a tyrant who would stop at nothing to maintain his hold on power. What began as the restoration of Hungary soon became a grim spectacle of authoritarian control, and Béla's kingdom became a place where the living were forced to endure the moral decay of their ruler. The very spirit of Hungary, once known for its vibrant culture and sense of unity, was slowly suffocated by Béla's iron rule. His transformation from a desperate ruler into a cold, unfeeling tyrant was complete. He had used the devastation of the Mongol invasion as a springboard to gain power, and now, having consolidated his position, he cared for nothing but maintaining that power. He cared little for the well-being of the people, for the welfare of the land, or for the ideals of justice and fairness that once guided Hungarian society. In the end, Béla's regime was one of cruelty and oppression, a kingdom where the ruler's thirst for power knew no limits, and where the people were nothing more than pawns in a game of survival. Under Béla IV, Hungary was no longer a land of hope, of renewal, or of prosperity. It was a kingdom where the light of freedom had been extinguished, and where the only thing that mattered was the will of a king who had become a tyrant. The suffering of the people, which had once been the catalyst for Béla's return, was now used to justify his reign of terror, his constant surveillance, and the complete suppression of dissent. His regime was a kingdom of ghosts, filled with the empty shells of those who had once dreamed of a better future, only to see their hopes crushed under the weight of Béla's oppressive rule. And so, Hungary's national rebirth, as promised by its king, was nothing more than a hollow illusion, one that served only to further entrench the tyrant who had emerged from the shadows of disaster. The ashes of war had barely settled on Hungary, but the psychological devastation was already evident in the hearts and minds of its people. The survivors of the Mongol invasion and later the harsh rule of Béla IV were left to navigate a land that had been not only physically ravaged but emotionally scarred as well. The psychological wounds were far deeper than any of the visible ones that could be treated with salves or bandages. These were the invisible scars that could never be fully healed, marks left on the soul and mind of a nation whose people had been betrayed, abandoned, and forced into labor by a ruler who saw them only as tools to achieve his own ends. The trauma of the Mongol invasion, followed by Béla's oppressive rule, was a poison that seeped into the very fabric of society. It was a poison that could not be easily purged, for it had taken root in the deepest recesses of the survivors' hearts. The people of Hungary, once vibrant with life, had become a shell of their former selves, haunted not only by the physical remnants of the destruction they had witnessed, but by the much darker, much more insidious effects that lingered long after the invasions had ended. The survivors, those few who had lived through the horrors of the Mongol invasion and the cruelty of Béla's rule, found themselves living in a state of constant unease. Trust had been shattered, and with it, any hope of ever rebuilding a sense of community or unity. The people had once placed their faith in their king, in their divine leaders, but now they found themselves questioning everything. Béla, who had once promised a return to order and justice, had proven to be no savior. His rule, instead of restoring peace, had deepened the rift between the people and their leaders. Béla's cruelty had destroyed any lingering faith the people had in royal justice or divine intervention. They had seen their homes burned to the ground, their families torn apart, and their lives shattered. And when they looked to the king for comfort, for protection, they had been met with more suffering, more oppression. What was supposed to be a time of national rebirth had become a time of despair. The survivors, haunted by their experiences, now found it impossible to believe in a system that had failed them so completely. The king's promises were nothing but empty words, and the hope that once lived in their hearts was now a distant, fading memory. The people, broken and distrustful, had been left to fend for themselves in a kingdom where no one, not even their monarch, seemed to care about their suffering. As the years went by, the psychological damage became more apparent. The survivors, those who had once lived their lives with ambition, with dreams of a bright future, now wandered through the cities like hollow shells. Their faces were drawn, their eyes vacant, their steps slow and hesitant. Even in the places that had been rebuilt, there was no life, no energy, no sense of community. The scars of war were written in the faces of the people and in the streets where they walked. They had seen their loved ones die, had seen their homes burned, and had been forced to rebuild under the watchful eyes of Béla's enforcers. There was no room for healing, no time for grief, no space for mourning. The people had been made to work through their pain, to suppress their emotions, to carry on as if everything were normal. But in truth, everything was shattered. The once proud kingdom of Hungary had been broken, its people irreparably scarred, and its soul forever tarnished by the horrors of the past. The trust that had once been placed in their leaders had been shattered, and now, only the silent weight of loss remained. There was no more joy, no more hope, only the lingering trauma of what had been lost. The wounds were deep, and they festered, infecting the very heart of the nation. With the psychological devastation came a new kind of folklore, one that spoke not of heroes and legends, but of the restless spirits that roamed the land, seeking justice for the wrongs that had been done to them. The stories of these spirits, born from the suffering of the people, began to spread throughout Hungary. It was said that the burned cities, now only husks of what they had once been, were haunted by the ghosts of those who had perished in the fires, in the massacres, and in the oppressive rule of Béla. These spirits, restless and angry, were said to wander the ruins, searching for those who had wronged them, seeking vengeance for the lives that had been taken so cruelly. The people, already living in a state of fear and distrust, began to speak of these spirits in hushed tones. They were no longer just tales for children or stories told around the fire. They became a part of the fabric of Hungarian society, woven into the very culture of the people. The cities, now rebuilt, were still seen as cursed, as places where the past could never truly be erased, where the memories of death and destruction lingered in the air, in the soil, in the very walls of the buildings that had been constructed. The spirits, it was said, could be heard at night, their mournful wails echoing through the empty streets, the sound of souls trapped between worlds, unable to rest. The haunting folklore that arose from the ashes of the invasion became a way for the people to process their grief, their anger, and their trauma. It was a way to give voice to the suffering they had endured, to acknowledge the horrors that had been inflicted upon them, and to give meaning to the pain that seemed to have no end. The stories of the restless spirits were not just stories of the dead. They were stories of the living, of those who had been left behind, who were still haunted by the ghosts of their past. The spirits, it seemed, were a reflection of the survivors themselves, who could not escape the trauma that had been seared into their memories. It was as though the land itself had become a reflection of the psychological scars of its people, a place where the past could never truly be forgotten, where the wounds could never truly heal. And so the ghosts roamed, not just in the cities but in the hearts of the people, who had been forever marked by the suffering they had endured. The idea of justice, too, began to change in Hungary. The people no longer believed in the justice of their king, nor did they believe in the divine order that had once seemed to govern their world. Instead, they sought justice in the form of the restless spirits, who, in their minds, were the true arbiters of right and wrong. The stories of the spirits seeking vengeance for their deaths became intertwined with the desire for retribution among the living. It was as though the people, now living in a world where there was no true justice, had turned to the supernatural for solace. The idea of divine retribution, once an abstract concept, now took on a much more personal form. The spirits, it seemed, were the only ones who could provide justice, and they did so not through mercy or forgiveness, but through anger and vengeance. The people, too, began to feel this anger, this desire for retribution, as they lived their lives in the shadow of the king's cruelty and their own pain. It was as if the land itself had become a place of reckoning, a place where the sins of the past could never be atoned for, and where the ghosts of the dead would always walk among the living. As the years passed, the psychological devastation of Hungary became not just a reality for the people, but a permanent part of the nation's identity. The ghosts of the past, both literal and metaphorical, never left the land. The kingdom that had once been a place of hope and possibility was now a place of ghosts. Ghosts of the dead, of the broken, of those who had been lost to history, and those who were still trapped in the emotional aftermath of their suffering. The people of Hungary, forever marked by their trauma, had no choice but to live in a world where the shadows of the past loomed over them, where the spirits of the dead walked among the living, and where the weight of their grief was an unshakable burden. The nation was scarred, not just by the violence that had been inflicted upon it, but by the deep psychological wounds that would never fully heal. And so, the Kingdom of Hungary, once proud and full of promise, became a kingdom of ghosts, a place where the past could never be forgotten, and where the spirits of the dead were the only ones who could truly understand the pain of the living. The legacy of Béla IV remains one of the most fiercely contested in Hungarian history, a subject of intense debate that has persisted for centuries. While some historians argue that Béla IV deserves to be hailed as the second founder of Hungary, others view him as nothing short of a destroyer, whose rule brought untold suffering to his people. The contrast in these interpretations reflects the complexity of Béla's character and his reign, a reign marked by both strategic vision and ruthless cruelty. On one hand, he was a monarch who managed to rebuild Hungary after the Mongol invasion, returning a nation to its feet after it had been nearly crushed by an unstoppable force. His return to the throne, following his hasty flight from the Mongol advance, was seen by some as a remarkable act of resilience. He seized the opportunity to reassert control over the kingdom, using the devastation of the invasion to push for sweeping reforms and fortify the kingdom's defenses. On the other hand, critics argue that Béla's methods, particularly his use of terror and repression to consolidate power, transformed him from a ruler in distress to a tyrant. The very measures that were lauded by some as necessary for national survival were viewed by others as the actions of a cruel and calculating ruler who exploited his people's suffering for his own gain. Béla IV's reign is a subject of moral debate that is still unresolved to this day. For those who see him as a visionary and a leader who salvaged Hungary from the brink of destruction, Béla's strategic actions are seen as necessary to ensure the survival and future strength of the kingdom. He used the chaos and fear created by the Mongol invasion to justify the introduction of harsh, even draconian measures, arguing that such steps were needed to rebuild the kingdom and protect its borders from future invasions. His establishment of new fortifications, his legal reforms, and his aggressive foreign policies were all aimed at fortifying Hungary in the face of a world that seemed determined to destroy it. He believed that only through complete control over the nobility and the common people could Hungary rise again. His use of forced labor to rebuild cities, his political purges to secure loyalty, and his strict surveillance of his subjects were seen by some as unpleasant but necessary tactics in the face of Hungary's near annihilation. According to this view, Béla was simply playing the cards he had been dealt, using whatever means necessary to restore his kingdom to its former strength. However, there is another view, one that condemns Béla for the very same actions. Critics argue that Béla's rise from victim to oppressor was not a mere strategy of survival, but a reflection of his moral decay. While his tactics may have been effective in terms of securing his rule and rebuilding Hungary, they came at a terrible cost. The psychological and physical toll of his reign on the people of Hungary is seen as a betrayal of the very ideals he was meant to defend. His transformation into a tyrant was not just a matter of political expediency, but of moral failure. The destruction he wrought, the purges he carried out, and the exploitation of his people left a deep scar on the nation, one that would persist long after his death. For many, the line between strategy and cruelty was blurred, and the question of whether Béla's actions were justified or simply brutal remains central to the debate over his legacy. Could his actions, often draped in the language of national survival, have been executed with more compassion? Or were they a demonstration of a darker side of human nature, a side that took pleasure in wielding power over those already broken by war? At the heart of this moral debate is the question of when strategy becomes cruelty, when the survival of a nation is balanced against the cost of human lives and dignity. Béla IV's rule raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of leadership in times of crisis. Was it truly necessary to impose such brutal measures in order to rebuild Hungary? Or was Béla simply using the Mongol invasion as an excuse to seize power and control? There are those who argue that Béla's authoritarian approach was a necessary evil, a tough but ultimately justified means of ensuring that Hungary would survive in a world that seemed to be constantly at war. In their eyes, his cruelty was born of necessity, the only way to establish order in a country fractured by invasion and internal strife. After all, Hungary had been on the verge of collapse, its defenses in disarray, its economy shattered, and its people traumatized by the Mongol onslaught. What Béla did, in their view, was bring Hungary back from the brink, laying the foundations for future generations to thrive. His actions were the harsh measures required to restore the kingdom to stability. Yet, critics argue that Béla's actions cannot be justified simply by invoking the language of national survival. The price of Hungary's rebirth, under Béla, was not just material but deeply moral. His reign was marked by an ever-growing disconnect between the leadership and the people. The survivors of the Mongol invasion, those who had borne the brunt of the destruction, now found themselves facing new hardships under Béla's rule. The once proud peasantry, who had worked the land, now found themselves subjected to forced labor, deprived of their freedom, and left to rebuild their cities amidst the ruins of their homes. The nobility, meanwhile, who had been instrumental in Béla's return to power, were often the beneficiaries of his harsh rule, rewarded with land and influence, while the common people were left to suffer. The political purges that Béla carried out to secure his rule were not just a matter of removing traitors, but of eliminating any potential threats to his authority, no matter how small. The common people were stripped of their rights, their voices silenced by the weight of the king's iron rule. At the core of this moral dilemma is the question of sacrifice. Were the lives of the common people, those who suffered under Béla's rule, truly necessary sacrifices for the greater good of the kingdom? Was Béla's ruthless treatment of his people justified by the need to secure Hungary's future? Or was it merely the brutal exercise of power by a king who had lost sight of his own humanity? For some historians, the question of sacrifice is central to understanding Béla's legacy. In their view, Béla's actions, however harsh, were driven by a genuine desire to protect Hungary and its people from further devastation. They argue that the sacrifice of a few for the good of the many was a concept as old as war itself, and that Béla's decisions, though painful, were ultimately necessary. His focus on rebuilding Hungary's defenses, his efforts to stabilize the kingdom, and his attempts to restore order in a fractured world were seen as acts of national duty, even if they came at the expense of the common people. On the other hand, there are those who see Béla's treatment of his people as a fundamental betrayal of the values he was supposed to uphold. Sacrifice, they argue, cannot be justified when it results in the suffering of innocent people. The lives of the commoners who were made to rebuild their cities amidst rotting corpses and the ashes of their homes were not just collateral damage. They were the victims of a regime that placed power and control above the well-being of the people. The moral cost of Béla's actions, in this view, was too high to be justified by any notion of national survival. His use of forced labor, his repression of dissent, and his heavy-handed tactics in securing loyalty all point to a ruler who valued power over humanity, who saw his people not as individuals with rights, but as mere instruments in his vision of a stronger Hungary. The debate over Béla IV's legacy is not just a matter of historical analysis, but of moral reflection. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of leadership and power, about the ethical limits of authority in times of crisis. The divide among historians reflects the tension between two opposing views of Béla. One that sees him as a necessary evil, a ruler who did what was required to save his kingdom, and another that condemns him as a cruel and tyrannical figure, whose actions left lasting scars on his people. In the end, Béla's legacy is not just about his achievements or his failures. It is about the choices he made and the moral implications of those choices. Was he a king who rose to the occasion, or a tyrant who took advantage of his people's suffering for his own gain? The answer to that question depends on one's perspective, and the debate over Béla IV's place in history is likely to continue for many years to come. Hungary, in the years following Béla IV's reign, had been rebuilt, at least in the sense of its physical structures. The king's harsh policies and authoritarian rule had transformed the kingdom, creating new fortresses and strengthening the defenses of its cities. The once shattered nation, reduced to smoldering ruins by the Mongol invasion, was now equipped with stronger walls, deeper ditches, and more fortified towns. The king's vision for Hungary, while cruel and oppressive in its execution, had resulted in the creation of a nation that was harder to invade, more secure, and seemingly more resilient. The great castles that dotted the Hungarian landscape stood as symbols of Béla's determination to protect his kingdom. These castles, with their thick stone walls and towering turrets, were built to withstand any external threat. They reflected the new face of Hungary, one that was prepared for the worst, that had learned from its traumatic history, and was determined not to be caught off guard again. In this sense, Béla's rule had indeed succeeded in fortifying the kingdom and ensuring its survival in a dangerous and unpredictable world. But these external fortifications, these visible signs of strength, concealed a far more troubling reality. Beneath the stone walls and battlements, Hungary's true strength had eroded. The people of Hungary, who had survived the brutality of the Mongol invasion and the tyrannical measures of their own king, were not the same as they had been before. Their morale was shattered, their spirits broken. The physical structures of Hungary had been rebuilt, but the collective soul of the nation was weak and fractured. The trauma that had been inflicted upon the people, both by the Mongols and by their own king's oppressive policies, could not be so easily repaired. Hungary may have become a more secure kingdom, but it was a kingdom of ghosts, empty, hollow, and bereft of the vitality that had once defined it. The nation's resilience came at a terrible cost. Béla IV's decision to prioritize survival over healing left the people of Hungary struggling to find meaning in their own lives. While the kingdom may have been physically restored, its people were broken, disillusioned, and filled with a profound sense of loss. The social fabric of the country had been torn apart by war, repression, and fear. And though the country had survived, it had done so at the expense of its people's emotional and psychological well-being. The people had been forced to rebuild not only their homes, but their very identities, their sense of belonging, and their trust in one another. Under Béla's reign, the nobility had been restored to power, but the common people had been relegated to a lower position, their labor extracted under harsh conditions, their voices silenced by the king's authoritarian rule. The economy had been restored, but the bonds of community had been shattered. The people no longer saw themselves as part of a unified nation. They saw themselves as individuals, each struggling to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. The sense of collective identity that had once defined Hungary was gone, replaced by a pervasive sense of isolation and fear. The Hungarian people had become accustomed to living under the constant shadow of tyranny, distrust, and uncertainty. They were survivors, yes, but their survival had come at a price that could never be fully paid. Béla's solution, while ensuring Hungary's physical survival, had never once taken into account the emotional and moral health of the nation. The people had been pushed to the brink of destruction, only to find that they had been rebuilt in a way that ensured their survival, but left them emotionally scarred and mentally exhausted. In the pursuit of a stronger, more secure Hungary, Béla had traded the soul of the nation for its physical well-being. His reign, which had been built on the backs of the people, had crushed their spirits and left them hollow. The nation that emerged from the ashes of Béla's policies was no longer a place of hope and unity. It was a place of survival, a place where the people were forced to carry on, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. The sense of joy, of community, of shared purpose was gone. What remained was a kingdom that had been rebuilt, yes, but at the cost of everything that had once made it vibrant and alive. Despite the external strength of the kingdom, Hungary's internal wounds ran deep. The resilience that had allowed the nation to survive was not born of hope, but of sheer willpower. The people had been forced to carry on, to rebuild their homes, their cities, their lives, but in doing so, they had buried their pain and trauma beneath the rubble of their former world. The walls of the castles, the new roads, and the rebuilt towns were all symbols of the external recovery, but they did nothing to heal the deep emotional scars left by Béla's reign. The trauma that the people had suffered, first under the Mongol invasion and then under Béla's cruel rule, had left them unable to fully recover. The king had rebuilt Hungary, yes, but he had done so in a way that ensured that the people would never again feel the same sense of unity, of pride, of joy that they once had. They had become a nation of survivors, but not of people who thrived. The resilience of the Hungarian people was remarkable, but it was the resilience of people who had been forced to endure, not of people who had been given the space to heal and flourish. Béla IV's emphasis on survival over healing left the Hungarian people isolated and disconnected from one another. There were no efforts to foster a sense of collective identity or purpose beyond the need to rebuild what had been destroyed. The idea of national rebirth that Béla had used to justify his authoritarian measures was a hollow one, a slogan that masked the deep emotional wounds of a people who had been brutalized by war and repression. The physical strength of Hungary may have been restored, but its moral and emotional strength was in tatters. The people no longer saw themselves as part of a unified, thriving nation. Instead, they were individuals, each focused on their own survival, each carrying the weight of the past with them, but unable to find solace in one another. The king's vision of a strong, unified Hungary had been built on a foundation of fear and exploitation. And while it may have led to a physically stronger kingdom, it had done so at the expense of the very soul of the nation. The scars of Béla's rule, which had been inflicted through forced labor, political purges, and the suppression of dissent, were still visible in the aftermath of his reign. The people of Hungary, though they had survived, were left to carry the burden of those scars for generations to come. The king's solution, though it ensured the kingdom's survival, had never addressed the deeper need for healing, for reconciliation, for the restoration of hope. As Hungary rebuilt itself in the shadow of its past, the people found themselves unable to move forward, unable to truly recover from the trauma they had endured. The kingdom may have been physically stronger, but it was spiritually weaker, a kingdom of broken people living in the ruins of their former lives. In the end, Béla IV's Hungary was not a nation that had been truly reborn. It was a nation that had survived, yes, but at a terrible cost. The physical walls and fortifications that had been built to protect the kingdom stood as grim reminders of the sacrifices that had been made. The people, who had once dreamed of a better future, now lived in a kingdom that had been rebuilt but never truly recovered. Béla's harsh methods, though successful in ensuring survival, had drained the life from the nation, leaving behind a shell of what could have been. The resilience of the Hungarian people, though remarkable, had come at a price that would haunt the kingdom for years to come. Hungary may have been stronger on the outside, but on the inside it was a kingdom of broken spirits, of people who had survived, but who would never truly be whole again. The tale of Béla IV and the Hungary he rebuilt is not just one of kings and battles, but of the quiet and insidious nature of power, fear, and the dangers that lie within a ruler's heart. Hungary, by the time Béla's reign had fully taken shape, was a kingdom gripped by fear, its people bound not only by the rubble of their cities, but by the invisible chains of a despotic regime. Béla, a man who once fled the Mongol invasion, now stood as the king who rebuilt, but at what cost? As the castle walls rose higher and the nation's defenses grew stronger, the moral foundation of Hungary was shattered. Béla's path to power, built on the wreckage of his kingdom and the lives of his subjects, serves as a grim reminder that the greatest threat to any society may not always come from external enemies, but from the decisions made within. His reign provides a dark cautionary tale, one that echoes throughout history, warning of the consequences when fear takes hold of a ruler's heart and drives them to act in ways that harm not only the people they rule, but the very soul of the nation they lead. Béla's kingdom was built on a foundation of fear. The king, having witnessed the destruction of his homeland and the horrors of the Mongol invasion, became a ruler who, rather than embracing the lessons of resilience and unity, chose to rule with a heavy hand. The Mongols, a foreign invader, were seen as Hungary's greatest threat, but Béla's actions demonstrated that the most dangerous enemies could often be those that arise within. His response to the Mongol devastation was not one of reconciliation or healing, but of brutal consolidation. While the people of Hungary had been battered by outside forces, it was Béla's decisions that left them broken on the inside. His insistence on using the fear and suffering of his people to secure his power forever altered the course of Hungary's future. He believed that by instilling fear into the hearts of his people, he could guarantee loyalty and restore order. But in doing so, he forged a kingdom ruled not by love or respect, but by submission and terror. Béla's thirst for control overshadowed any desire for true recovery. The walls of Hungary's cities may have been rebuilt, but the emotional and psychological walls that Béla erected around his kingdom would last far longer, creating a legacy of fear that seeped into every corner of the land. The greatest threats that Hungary faced under Béla's rule were not the Mongols, nor were they any external invaders. Instead, the greatest danger was Béla himself. The king, once a victim of his own circumstances, transformed into a ruler who saw enemies in every corner of his kingdom. In an effort to prevent Hungary from falling again, Béla implemented measures that stripped away personal freedoms, crushed dissent, and destroyed any hope of healing the land's deep emotional wounds. His actions, though seemingly justified by the chaos of the Mongol invasion, were more akin to a man drowning in fear rather than a king leading his people through a time of recovery. Béla's decisions, his purges, his use of forced labor, his intense surveillance of his people, were all born from a place of fear, a fear of losing control, of seeing the kingdom he had worked so hard to rebuild slip through his fingers. This fear drove him to make decisions that not only ensured Hungary's survival, but also ensured that it would never recover, never heal. The people, though physically rebuilding, were spiritually decimated. The question that lingers, then, is whether Béla's actions were truly necessary for the kingdom's survival, or whether they were a manifestation of his inability to let go of fear and trust in the resilience of his people. Had Béla been capable of seeing beyond his own paranoia, he might have realized that the greatest strength Hungary had was not its walls or its defenses but the spirit of its people. But Béla's decision to rule through fear crushed that spirit and, in the end, created a kingdom of empty strength. The legacy of Béla IV serves as a potent reminder that when leaders act out of fear, they risk becoming destroyers disguised as saviors. This warning has echoed through history, as countless rulers have been driven to acts of cruelty by the very fear that was meant to protect them. Béla IV's reign is a stark example of how fear, when allowed to dominate, can corrupt a leader and blind them to the humanity of those they govern. What Béla failed to recognize was that the very measures he put in place to protect his kingdom were the same ones that stripped it of its soul. A kingdom of fear is not a kingdom that can thrive, and Béla's Hungary, while strong on the outside, was hollow on the inside. It was a kingdom built on the bones of its people, a kingdom that would never be whole again. When Béla took the throne, he saw the Mongol invasion as an existential threat to his kingdom. He saw the death and destruction around him as proof that Hungary needed a strong hand, a decisive ruler who would do whatever it took to ensure the survival of the nation. But in his quest to restore Hungary to its former glory, Béla allowed fear to dictate his every move. Instead of uniting the people in their shared struggle for survival, he divided them, turning them into subjects who could not question his authority, who could not challenge his decisions. His political purges, the destruction of noble families who dared to defy him, and the forced labor of the common people were not actions of a man trying to heal a wounded kingdom. They were actions of a man who feared losing the power he had regained. Béla's decisions were not made with the long-term good of the nation in mind, but with the short-term need to secure his reign. The result was a kingdom that was physically stronger but morally weaker, a kingdom that would survive but would never truly recover from the damage Béla had inflicted upon its people. His rule had shown the world that fear, when allowed to take root, does not build, it destroys. As Béla's reign progressed, the people of Hungary became more isolated, more distrustful of their own leaders. The very men and women who had fought so hard to rebuild their homes and cities now found themselves trapped in a world where their every move was watched, where their loyalty was questioned, and where their futures were uncertain. Béla's decision to use terror as a tool of control ensured that Hungary would survive, but it also ensured that it would be a place where the people lived not in hope, but in submission. The great castles that dotted the Hungarian landscape, the fortifications that were meant to protect the people, had become symbols of Béla's power. They stood as monuments to his rule, but they were also a reminder that Hungary's strength had come at a cost, the cost of the people's dignity and spirit. Béla had thought that by building stronger walls, by fortifying his kingdom against the outside world, he could secure his place in history. But in the process, he had built walls around the hearts of his people, walls that no external enemy could ever break down, but that would keep Hungary from ever being whole again. The warning of Béla IV's reign is clear. When leaders act out of fear, they risk becoming the very thing they fear. Béla, in his desperation to protect Hungary from the Mongols and other threats, became a tyrant who not only protected the kingdom from external enemies, but also waged a war on his own people. His regime, which had once promised hope and rebuilding, became a symbol of oppression, where the true cost of survival was measured not in resources or territory, but in the souls of the people. Béla's actions were justified in his mind by the need to protect the kingdom, but the price of that protection was the very essence of Hungary. He traded the soul of his people for the safety of his throne, and in doing so, he created a kingdom that could not heal, a kingdom that could not recover from the damage that had been done. The lesson that Béla's reign offers is one that is often repeated in history, that fear, when allowed to guide a ruler's actions, leads to cruelty disguised as necessity. In the end, the kingdom may survive, but it is a hollow victory, a victory built on the suffering and oppression of the very people it was meant to protect. Béla IV's legacy is a tragic reminder of the dangers of fear-driven leadership. While the external strength of his kingdom may have been restored, the emotional and moral cost of his reign was too high. His actions, though aimed at securing the future of Hungary, created a fractured, distrustful society, one that could never fully recover from the wounds inflicted by its own ruler. And in the end, Béla's kingdom was not the beacon of hope he had envisioned, but a dark and broken place, where the cost of survival had been measured in fear, pain, and lost humanity. Béla IV's reign is remembered not for the triumphs of victory or the prosperity of his kingdom, but for the immense cost that Hungary paid under his rule. The history of Béla's time on the throne is a tale of ash and silence, where the land may have been rebuilt, but the very essence of what made Hungary a vibrant and united kingdom was lost. Béla's rule, shaped by fear and driven by a desperate need to rebuild what had been lost in the Mongol invasion, left behind a legacy that was not one of honor or glory, but of profound loss. The walls that were erected, the defenses that were built, were meant to protect Hungary from external enemies, but they also served to isolate the people within. The rebuilding was done not in the name of unity or recovery, but to ensure the survival of a king who feared losing his power. Béla's reign, which he may have seen as one of restoration, was in reality one of destruction, a destruction of hope, of trust, and of the very soul of the kingdom. The price of his survival strategy was steep. It cost the Hungarian people their sense of identity, their faith in leadership, and their belief in a future where they could once again thrive. Béla IV's Hungary was one that could survive, yes, but it would never be the same. It would rise from the ashes, but in doing so, it would leave behind the memories of what had been lost. The people of Hungary, having weathered the Mongol invasion and the tyrannical reign of their own king, found themselves haunted by their survival. The nation may have risen again, its cities rebuilt and its defenses strengthened, but the scars of Béla's rule ran deep. These were not the kind of scars that could be healed by physical labor or by the rebuilding of walls and buildings. These were the invisible wounds, fear, distrust, and grief, that the people carried with them in their daily lives. They had lived through the nightmare of the Mongol invasions, only to face the even darker reality of a king who used their suffering to solidify his own power. The psychological toll of Béla's reign was as devastating as the physical toll of the invasions, and it lingered long after his death. The survivors, those few who had lived through the brutality of his rule, found themselves adrift in a kingdom that had been rebuilt but was not whole. They had rebuilt their homes, their towns, and their cities, but the trust that once held them together had been shattered, and the sense of community was lost. Béla's actions, carried out under the guise of protection and survival, had fractured the very foundation of Hungarian society. The people, who had once stood together in times of peace and prosperity, now lived in isolation, each person focused on their own survival, unable to trust one another, unable to believe in a future where they could live without fear. The grief that came with Béla's reign was not just about the loss of life, but about the loss of humanity. The people had survived, but at what cost? The invisible wounds that they carried were a constant reminder that survival, when it comes at the expense of one's soul, is not something to be celebrated. As history reflects upon Béla IV's reign, one question remains at the forefront. Was he a strategist, a king who did what was necessary to save his kingdom? Or was he a butcher, a ruler who sacrificed his people in the name of power and control? The ambiguity surrounding Béla's legacy is a testament to the complexity of his rule. There are those who view him as a visionary, a king who, though harsh and cruel, acted out of a genuine desire to protect his kingdom from further devastation. His fortification of Hungary's defenses, his political purges, and his control over the nobles were seen by some as necessary measures to ensure the kingdom's survival. After all, Hungary had been brought to the brink of destruction, and Béla's actions, no matter how extreme, were seen by some as the only way to rebuild a shattered nation. In this light, Béla becomes a tragic figure, a ruler who was forced to make hard choices in the face of overwhelming odds, a king who sacrificed the well-being of his people in order to preserve the future of the kingdom. His actions, while brutal, were seen as part of a larger strategy to secure Hungary's place in a world where survival was a constant battle. Yet, there are those who view Béla in a far darker light, seeing him not as a strategist, but as a butcher in royal robes. His decisions, in their eyes, were not made out of necessity, but out of a desire for control, power, and dominance. Béla's purges, his use of forced labor, and his brutal repression of dissent were not acts of survival but acts of tyranny. He used the suffering of his people to justify his reign, and in doing so, he became a ruler who oppressed those he was supposed to protect. The rebuilding of Hungary, while outwardly a success, was nothing more than a facade that concealed the suffering of the common people. The physical strength of the kingdom was restored, but its moral foundation had been shattered. Béla's actions were not those of a king trying to save his people, but of a man who feared losing his power and was willing to sacrifice the soul of the kingdom to keep it. In this view, Béla becomes a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the corrupting influence of fear. His legacy is one of destruction, not restoration, and his actions, while initially justified by the need to protect Hungary, ultimately left the kingdom weaker, divided, and broken. The truth of Béla IV's reign lies somewhere between these two extremes. He was undoubtedly a ruler who made difficult decisions in the face of overwhelming challenges. His actions, though harsh, were born from a genuine desire to protect his kingdom and ensure its survival. But in doing so, he lost sight of the very humanity that made Hungary a great nation. His focus on survival, on building walls and fortifications, blinded him to the needs of his people. And in the end, he sacrificed their trust, their spirit, and their unity for the sake of security. Béla's reign serves as a dark reminder that the pursuit of survival, when done without regard for the well-being of the people, can lead to destruction. His actions, though intended to protect Hungary, ultimately tore the kingdom apart, leaving behind a nation that was physically strong but morally bankrupt. In conclusion, Béla IV's legacy is a complicated one, marked by both triumph and tragedy. While Hungary may have survived his reign, the cost of that survival was immense. The people of Hungary, though they rose again, did so as a broken and fractured society, their wounds invisible but deep. Béla's actions, driven by fear and the desire for control, ensured the survival of the kingdom, but at the expense of its soul. His reign is a grim reminder that even the act of saving a nation can become an act of self-destruction when humanity is forgotten. Béla IV's legacy is not one of glory or victory, but of a king who, in his quest to protect his kingdom, ultimately lost everything that made it worth saving. The kingdom may have risen from the ashes, but its people were forever marked by the fear, distrust, and grief that Béla's rule had imposed upon them. The shadow of his reign loomed over Hungary for generations to come, a dark cautionary tale of the dangers of ruling through fear and the devastating cost of sacrificing humanity for the sake of survival. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.